Hey, what's up, Team 8-0? Welcome to our inaugural edition of Mythbusters. This episode or edition of Mythbusters will be connected to our study of wars and our comparative study, really, of wars, specifically the Vietnam War and the Civil War. In order to answer our essential question, can division ever be repaired? We need to first identify what's fact and what's fiction. So here we go. Part one begins now. And this Mythbusters is specifically about Vietnam. And I started with Vietnam because Vietnam is where a lot of myths were perpetuated or flying around. So what better way to start than with clarifying some truth? So let's start with myth number one. Myth number one was that most Vietnam veterans were drafted. What does it mean to be drafted? Drafted means that you were forced by the government to enlist in the military for a set amount of time. You really didn't have a choice. So you couldn't volunteer. You were made to do so. You were made to serve. And so according to many, or many believed, that most of the veterans that served were drafted. And quite frankly, that's just not true. 66% of the servicemen who fought in Vietnam volunteered to do so. And that's a pretty high number, especially when we compare it to World War II, when 66% of men, or around 60, I won't exaggerate, 60% of servicemen were drafted. So World War II, 60% were drafted. Vietnam, 66% volunteered. Totally different scenario. And contrary to popular belief, being drafted wasn't a death sentence. Actually, more people, the percentage of people who died were mostly those who volunteered. So 70% of those killed in Nam were volunteers and volunteered to be there. So, myth busted. Myth number two. A disproportionate number of black servicemen were killed in Vietnam. And the truth is that 86% of men who died in service to our country in Vietnam were white men. And 12.5 of the men were black who died. And that's a direct correlation to the percentage of blacks who lived in the United States during the time of Vietnam. That myth might have something to do with the era in which Vietnam was fought. So Vietnam comes on the heels of the civil rights movement. And as blacks were fighting for their rights in this country, many saw it unfavorable for them to be fighting in Vietnam. See Muhammad Ali's quote about Vietnam. Myth two, busted. Let's move on to myth number three. I'll throw that paper away. Myth three. Many servicemen were poor and uneducated. False. Well-to-do servicemen were everywhere. And actually 79% of servicemen were high school educated. And at that point in time, that was a good percentage of education. And quite frankly, well-to-do servicemen had a higher risk of death because they might be serving as airplane pilots and officers in the war. So it wasn't a war of uneducated and poor servicemen. Just not true. Myth number four. The average age of an infantry man fighting in Nam was 19. The actual age is 23. And if you're thinking, what's the big deal? It's only 3 years. Let's think about it like this. That's the difference between a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. Some of you guys have siblings that are 3, and you can't wait for them to become 6, right? Or the difference between a 13-year-old, which some of you guys are now, and a 16-year-old. Big difference. You can see the difference now, right? And while this is a fairly young 22 to serve, Considering the average age of a World War II infantryman was 26, it's still not as young as many people thought. Myth 4, busted. Now let's move on to our final myth, myth 5. America lost the war in Vietnam. This is a tough one because this is one that historians are still debating to this day. So, to give you an answer, I can't. I really can't clarify this myth, but I can give you some information from scholars. So, some scholars say that the Americans really performed in an unprecedented way during this battle, and that it was very rare that they lost an actual battle. But here's the thing, Vietnam was really never declared a war. So, how can you win or lose something that was never declared? Think about that. Also, our troops were pulled out, and so that it wasn't that we were defeated, it's that we decided that our interest in Vietnam was no longer necessary, or our involvement. I shouldn't say our interest, our involvement in Vietnam was no longer necessary. So I will let you be the judge of that myth because it's a hard one. Remember, you got to know the facts before you can know anything else. You got to know fact from fiction. So I hope this helps clarify all the myths about Vietnam and help you to answer those essential questions.